Um, then I would just like to say hello and welcome. And I'm very, very glad you could join us today. And I'm very glad, I will just say it one more time, that we're actually here. And I won't tell you about the fun hiccup we had. But hallelujah and thank you to Mayar's students who got us here. My name's Blair Miller, and I'm a proud member of NICP Outreach. And I'm also affiliated with the Dana Crawford Preservation Program at Fireside Chat. And it's brought to you by NICP of our collective past and the important work of telling and preserving all stories that paint a more complete picture of our American history, our collective history. This session is being recorded and will be placed on the NICP YouTube channel at a point in the future. By way of introduction, I'm going to ask our guests to tell their own stories and to introduce themselves. Sarah Marsom, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Marsom. I'm a heritage resource consultant based in the Midwest, but I have the pleasure of also working with the Dana Crawford Preservation Program at the University of Colorado, Denver, offering student support services. And I do a lot of work tied to strategic planning and organizational change in the field. And I'm very happy to be the moderator and facilitator for the session today with Dr. Andrea Roberts. Dr. Roberts is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia, where she also serves as faculty director of the Center of Cultural Landscapes and affiliate faculty of the Department of Architectural History and the Woodson Institute. So our conversation today, we're trying to make it more of a conversation and not just talking to you all. So we're going to have a guided presentation with questions. If you have questions about our talk, throw them in the chat and we will make sure to cover those. We want to just have fun exploring what shifting preservation pedagogy looks like for all of us for the benefit of the field and the future. So I will be sharing my screen, but Dr. Roberts will be answering our first question, which is very basic to help us learn who she is beyond UVA Center for Cultural Landscapes founder. So, Dr. Roberts, why did you choose to enter the field of academia?
So there's two reasons. One is about home and one is about career. So one of the things that I found astounding is that I entered the third decade of my life not knowing that my own family had ties in Texas that took us back to the original 300 Anglo settlers of the state who brought with them people that they held captive, captive Africans that were enslaved. And I didn't know this until my third decade, not because my parents didn't expose me to African American history and culture, but because local history and culture was in the background. It wasn't in the forefront of our understanding of where we lived. Our understanding of where we lived was that we lived in one of the places with the highest concentration of African American home ownership. It was almost equally Asian, African American, Anglo, and Latino makeup of Fort Bend County, where I grew up, right outside of Houston, Texas. So it was not knowing all these things and having that revelation as I was losing family members. As you get older, some of the people you think will always be around are no longer around, and they are carrying these memories and this history with them. And as I began to spend more time with them, losing them, and studying that history, there was a grand disconnect between what I was learning was an entire cultural landscape of African American place creation, place making, and settlement that wasn't part of the day-to-day life as a head of the planning division for the City of Houston's Housing Community Development Department. And so in that capacity, I was responsible for oversight of planning for HUD funding, as well as for disaster recovery funding in Houston, Texas. And what was astounding is the grand disconnect between people who organized and had their identity around these places And that sense of identity in those places being absolutely invisible from the work I was doing day to day. People were thought of as concentrations of Black folks on a map. They weren't thought about people who created neighborhoods. They were people who were relegated to living in particular areas, or were people were part of a concentration of Black folks in one area, or you were part of a concentration of poverty. And all of that languaging made visible to me the lack of attention in the field of planning to the power of place and the significance of agency of folks and communities. Yes, there's tons of literature on engagement, and we talk every day about engagement, and there's statutory requirements for engagement that I was well aware of while I worked in the city of Houston, and previous to that, helped run the budget process for the city of Philadelphia. So I had all of this prior to getting a PhD. So I was well steeped in the career of public finance and public planning. But what I found in municipal government was a lack of attention to these very specific ways that people thought about race and place, in a positive way, in an affirmative way. And rather than planning happening to them, they wanted to see planning processes that they were more at the center of. Now, just to give you context, this is 2008 through about 2011 that I was doing most of this work, or rather from Philadelphia would be around 2006 through 2011 in Philadelphia and in the city of Houston, doing this work in government, and really seeing a lot of interesting approaches to what we mean when we say public engagement. So it was seeing all of that that made me think about entering academia to both address these bigger questions about what makes a place in a planning process. That means what makes it worth recognizing and seeing as a constituency associated with a place that can be defined. When is that the case and when it's not the case, and what difference does that make? That was the big question in my head. How could there be this sort of invisibility around these people in these places? And I wanted to get that answer, and I wanted to put out planners that were frankly not like the planners that I worked with. Very hardworking, dedicated people with considerable expertise, but so entrenched and caught in the daily, machinations of what it takes to make a city run, that there wasn't much time or space to stop and question the system as it was working. And also, I wanted to be a part of building people more equipped to understand how they can go into such systems and make change. So I thought there was a more systemic way to think about change, was to go into education and mold the minds of future planners and preservationists. And the slides that we're showing, the first was just a slide of kind of my family in Fort Bend County, including the Imperial Sugar Refinery. And that is a landscape steeped in slavery and convict leasing. But all of that has surfaced only in the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years, and has not been part of the public discourse until then. And then what you see here is the kind of products or the kinds of things that I created and the kinds of people that I encountered in Texas during public hearings in the city council chambers, and during public hearings in the city of Philadelphia during their annual budget hearings, when people would come and say to city council members that they weren't paying enough attention to their neighborhood. So I had a comparison of people who had very defined neighborhoods, and people who did have defined neighborhoods, but also whole communities in Houston and surrounding Houston that didn't fit the neighborhood mold, didn't fit the ward mold, and didn't fit the mold of a place that Black folks lived because they didn't have a choice. There were some other places, and I was most interested in foregrounding those.
and I think your journey toward teaching really illuminates the importance of lived experiences shaping our perspectives, right? Our lived experience, and you worked prior to transitioning toward teaching and pursuing your PhD,
Oh,
which
yeah.
really has influenced your research. So, what are
Yes.
your research focus areas today, and what were they when you first began your path in academia?
When I first started in academia, I was somewhat driven by my individual history because it was telling me something deeper I knew about the invisibility of Black placemaking and Black placekeeping. And what I was seeing in my own story of having ties, having roots in communities known alternatively as Black settlements, Black towns, freedom colonies, having relatives that I would visit on a regular basis in these places, but not seeing them as places. Um, there was a certain erasure of those places until I found a cemetery that most of my relatives had been buried in. That was maybe about, 7 minutes from my house. So it's something I passed by often until I walked through that cemetery one day and found that there were so many formerly enslaved people that were buried there that you could determine that by the birth date. They had my family names. I began starting to make a family tree. And so when I began to explore the history of that cemetery, it was, I determined or learned that it was part of a mutual aid association called the Farmers Improvement Society that had members in 21,000 members in 3 states. It was huge. Its founder was someone who was mentored by Booker T. Washington. And I thought there's this incredible history sitting in Stafford, Texas. This is amazing. And so I looked at these notions of planning that existed in the form of mutual aid societies, particularly this mutual aid society when I first started my research. And that led me to learning about where these mutual aid societies and their cemeteries were most active and most prevalent. And I ran into a book called Freedom Colonies. And what I found in that book was a collection of, I would say, a very dense literature review of a number of dissertations or theses on different Black communities. And then in the back of the book was a long list of places that the author had assumed might be freedom colonies. So there were names of places that, based on population and timing, he guesstimated that they might be historic Black places that he called freedom colonies. And after further investigation, I found that there were tons of books about Black places that talked about their decline and their destruction. There were these theses and there were these dissertations about these places as historical sites that were in the past. And there were even a chapter or two about freedom colonies in the present, but it was all about how they struggled decline. But I didn't find a source that was one trying to make visual or accessible the histories of these places and the people in the present still dedicated to them. So people were thinking of these places, or what we're customarily taught is to memorialize Black places and places that we've created. And so what I learned, I was taken to a particular community in Deep East Texas that's on the way to Louisiana called Shankleville. And what I found in Shankleville was what you see in the diagram here. My big question was what I found in Shankleville. I wanted to know if it is a pattern that is present in other settlements, in other Black communities that are intentionally created. Is it true that the foundational story like that of the Freedom Colony of Shankleville about two enslaved Africans who reunite after one fled Mississippi and one was sold to a master in Texas and fled from Mississippi to Texas to join her, in this great love story that is leveraged as a foundational story of how a place was created even before emancipation, that fostered celebrations and social network connection at these celebrations that fostered an attachment to place, meaning people would come literally from around the world who knew that they had some tie to Shankleville community. They would come from far away as Australia, New York City, Virginia. I witnessed this when I spent time there. And then that attachment to place, wanting to come back, actually would encourage them to participate and exercise a commitment. And that commitment would come out in committing to provide money to sustain cemeteries, in the way of actually spending almost every weekend to rehabilitate a historic Black homestead, which is now on the National Register of Historic Places. It came out in homecoming presidents who ensured that the event would happen every year. So this is real participation, and it's all the makings of placekeeping and preservation. And then I found that this led to real planning outcomes. Not figuratively, not like planning outcomes, but actual planning outcomes of people reinvesting, there being different forms of recognition of people being an embodied source of places that may not have any population anymore. But during these celebrations, their oral tradition, their commemorative practices and rituals were invoking the memory of these places and their founders. And that this was a cycle that was feeding itself. And it was a cultural sustainability cycle that I wanted to test. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I've been going to communities, or I've been working with people from these communities to test, so to speak, the validity of this claim that there is a relationship between Black oral tradition, commemorative practices, and place preservation in Black settlements and towns, and that it is a positive relationship and not just a figurative one that doesn't have any real outcomes. But I've been recording or surveying people to learn about those outcomes ever since.
And whenever you speak about your work, I always end up visualizing like a tree, right? Like there are roots and your roots can extend further. And
Yeah.
what you're looking at is it's not just about people living in communities today. It's about the people who have the layers of history tied there, and how do we keep those roots growing out and,
Yes.
feeding and nourishing the tree.
Right.
So, of course, you are first and foremost a researcher and an innovator, but how does that translate into your course development? What are you currently working on and teaching, and how has that evolved from your projects like the Texas Freedom Colonies?
Yeah, I think that one of the hallmarks of the Texas Freedom Colonies project was the student mentoring. So the students that worked on my research team that really co-published with me, so they have co-publishing credits, they have their own projects that they have named, and that they have as both nonprofit and for-profit entities. So there are people out there that have been a core part of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which started as part of that work back in 2014. So the project, which most people know as an online map, is actually really about connection with descendants, whether it be online, in person. We are a hybrid initiative, and that means that we are working with communities to grow their existing work in communities where they are already collecting this history, these stories, these assessments of need. But we connect and collect and countermap and secure data based on those narratives that are shared in a survey form or are shared, recorded. A lot of people think I'm the queen of oral history or oral histories, and I always tell them I have structured interviews. I did a lot of oral histories as part of my dissertation work, but I have structured interviews that I ask in people very pointed questions because of facts I want to know. And in the course of that, I happen to find out other things. But we really get the location data out of what people are saying and out of what they are writing, and use that to spatialize where these places are. There's a number of places we're never on that list. And so my teaching has been very much about getting students to embrace co-researching, getting students to embrace seeing descendant descendants of the founders of these places who are committed to their preservation, I want the students to understand them as having a form of expertise, not as a source to exploit or as a source to say, look, I talked to this old Black person, isn't this interesting? Not that people necessarily mean any harm, but I found a continual approach, a pretty consistent approach to working with particularly African American communities in academia, of assuming that number one, African Americans don't know the value of the information of the place they have, and they have to either be taught the value, or outsiders have to take control of a preservation project because it's assumed that they can't possibly grasp the magnitude of the importance of what's to be done. And this is a very discovery Columbus type approach to preservation and preservation education that I've seen over and over and over. And so really what I've been doing with a lot of my students is part of the co-researching is, as you see in this picture, is going and working in Prairie View A&M. All of these students that I took with me were undergraduate students in a class called More Than Monuments, Preservation and Social Justice. And I took these students out to Prairie View A&M for them to learn about the wealth of the archives at this HBCU, which was a whopping, I guess, 30 minutes from the Texas A&M campus, and not a one of them had ever been there before. And so it was really in trying to level the playing field in terms of their understanding of the resources and the wealth of knowledge available at HBCUs. And it was an invaluable source. They learned to read documents of what was the original Negro Extension Service in Texas, and the records that are at Prairie View A&M, which have place location information. And all of this was in service of Gloria Smith. So the other piece of the way that we approach the work is I spend a lot of time figuring out what people actually need and not what I think they need. The other piece is, as I said before, how are we using these opportunities of crisis to shift and really be responsive to what's happening and not just our immediate research needs? Sometimes people were less interested in giving me place narratives and wanted a space to share their survival narratives and their resistance narratives. That happened in 2020, which was a time of the pandemic. This was 2020 through 2021, where there was a lot of virtual online education, where we created space for what we called coffee talk. And one of my students at the time, a doctoral student, helped create this talk show, which was essentially doing Facebook Lives and YouTube. And the channel's still available and you can watch our shows, which were one-on-ones with descendants who wanted to talk about the racial uprising of the time, to talk about monuments on campus, to talk about cemetery preservation, talk about digital preservation, to talk about what are funeral practices like and how are they changing. And we had a digital Juneteenth program that you see highlighted here. So we never discontinued promoting the Atlas, but we did make our resources available and encourage our own students to be responsive to what was happening, and how do we leverage these resources to preserve what's actually going on, what will be our future history. And that's what they did a lot of during the pandemic. And as I said before, mentorship is huge. Right now, I am presently developing my teaching and coursework in light of the new initiative that I'll talk about in a moment, the Mellon-funded initiative, Outsider Preservation Initiative. But most of my former students are teaching elsewhere, and we're developing, papers and writing agendas together. But a lot of what we did as a team was to think more long-term about all of this as a movement. And the students really helped me to understand that in a new way, because they wanted to take things in all kinds of directions. And I was like, oh, you want to create a show? Okay. Oh, you want to create a registry of cemeteries? Okay, that's fine. And so it was having this openness to wanting people to feel that under the umbrella of place preservation, they had the opportunity to really explore a lot of different means, a lot of online storytelling, doing atlas demonstrations. They really became leaders in the course of doing this and published authors.
I think you touched on a really valuable approach to shifting preservation pedagogy. Is traditionally when we view mentorship, it's a top-down approach. It's the person with the 20, 30, 40 plus years. It's the person with professor in their title. They're the mentor. And what you describe is that it was a dual mentorship approach where you were getting to learn new strategies and new tactics as well from your students.
Yeah, absolutely.
How else would you say that over the number of years that you've been a teacher at Texas A&M, at UVA, that your pedagogy has shifted thanks to that mentorship or exposure to new preservation strategies? Because clearly you're looking at historic preservation from a very intersectional approach.
Yes, I think that it has made me think more about how are we actually equipping students not only to do historical research, but to practically engage in project management. And so as part of one of my classes that I taught spring 2024, which is rural planning and preservation practice. And that is where you see Ms. Carmen Smith, who we call an outsider preservationist. She's a salvage and recovery specialist, and it's a big part of her work is going into abandoned buildings that are about to be destroyed and finding material. And she created her own informal archive in this Rosenwald School. She knows it's the Paul Lawrence Dunbar Rosenwald School. She's aware of its value. She used some of her own retirement money to keep the building standing and to sustain its integrity. And when I came to her and asked her what she really needed, she said, well, maybe we need a little organization in that room. And so most of the way things are shifting for me right now are teaching the students not just, hey, let's go make the story map, but how do we scope this project? One of the most important things to know how to do is to scope and organize the work. Right, ordinarily there's tremendous pressure on us as professors to have everything set out so that they can have a seamless, easy learning experience. Even if you do all of that, you still won't have a seamless learning experience. So you might as well give them a realistic learning experience. So everything is planned. We spent more than half of the semester every week in community. So rather than, us do our work in a vacuum, we did our work and at a midpoint showed Carmen our work and showed a funder or Justin Reed, who works at Charlottesville Charitable Foundation. We got an interim report. So everything was very much structured in ways that they had to be accountable. They had to think about organizing the work, and they had to think about how they were going to improve the work based on the interim, rather than here's the perfectly curated final beautiful event at the end, which we did have, but we had spots along the way where they constantly had to interact with Carmen. They had to interview her for oral histories about the different items that were in the room and understand why they were historically significant. And then they made 3D models of them. So there's a 3D library of many of the items in the room. And there was also a story map about one family with a road named after them, and we examined all of these records that she salvaged from a house that was going to be destroyed, which were all of these school books that a teacher had that marked people's attendance and their names and attendance and when they purchased milk, like all these little details. And they had the last name of this family, Anderson, and we had funeral programs. And so they were able to take just one family to understand the diaspora surrounding the area and invited those family members too to our final presentation, and then talked about what they'd like to see next. So I think the shift has been in really trying to get them to understand how to phase work and scope work in ways that center the descendant or center the so-called client.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Pushing past theory into practice and deep skill development ways. Your work is pushing pedagogy in the classroom, in the field, and your newest initiative, the Outsider Preservation Initiative, is kind of the culmination of a number of ideas that have been fermenting in the classroom through your research, through your newer role as the director of the Center of Cultural Landscapes. Can you tell us more about the Outsider Preservation Initiative? Who is an outsider preservationist? Where the concept emerged? Where is it at today? And how in the big grant that helped fund this, you intentionally put shifting pedagogical practices in the cake, baking it in.
It's a 4-layer cake. You had to say cake, so I had to. It's a 4-layer cake, which includes the development of a new portal for showcasing the work of our mini grant recipients of our mini grant program, who in turn are developing or becoming part of communities of practice who are showing up at symposia that we fund, that in turn also produce new pedagogy that centers descendant-led work. So all of these 4 parts, the portal, the education, the symposia, and the mini grants all feed one another, and they feed outsider preservationists. So every African-American grassroots preservationist is not an outsider preservationist. What makes someone outsider? In this iteration, we are definitely looking at African Americans, and we're looking at those who do descendant-led work in little-known historic Black settlements and towns. Our emphasis is those who operate outside of formal preservation and have goals that maybe are outside of what we think everyone's goals should be in historic preservation. Recognition may not look like a historical marker. What it takes to facilitate the return, because we're not just preserving the history and saying, great, we remember, isn't it wonderful? Here's the marker, here's the story. We're saying, how are you reenacting the power of this story through creativity in place in such a way that it causes the diaspora to return and reinvest, even if they return virtually or literally. But our grant money is to help people facilitate the return through creative storytelling in place. And what is an outsider preservationist? It is someone, as I said, who's operating outside the field, and it's in the tradition of the visionary or outsider artists who operate with genius and often spiritual insight and missionary zeal to create art without any formal instruction. And what we are illuminating through this are those who, without formal instruction, but with the right supports, because we don't want to set people up to fail, but with the right supports, are able to create these visions of a new historic preservation practice, which in fact is also very, very old. But with the centering of architecture in historic preservation, the way that it's codified and centered, the practice of architecture, there's a whole set of practices subordinated in the process. And that would be the commemorative practices that have people return back to place, the opportunities that are created to facilitate pilgrimages back, that also cause people to find very innovative ways to save cemeteries that in urban spaces are commonly destroyed. So we're finding innovation, we're finding creativity, and we're doing it in 4 different nodes are part of North America. And this is just a start. And the rationale for those nodes is because of migration patterns. We started in Texas. So our logical out-migration stories that we're seeking are out in California. The local stories are of those migrations that are more nearby, from urban to rural or from Louisiana into Texas. And then we look at the node that is Virginia. We can tie somewhere between 70-75% of all individuals who are of African descent can tie their lineage to someone who was enslaved or brought into Virginia. So it is a giant hub, and a lot of the founders of Texas, the founders of the Republic of Texas, who held so many in bondage, came from Virginia and Tennessee and parts of other states that were once part of Virginia, including the Carolinas. So we have the Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland and DC, basically the DMV area as one concentrated area. And then the last is Nova Scotia because of the outmigration of formerly enslaved people to Nova Scotia to form some 52 historic Black settlements after fighting as Black loyalists for the British. So we have an exploration of these undertold stories. Commonly, we hear stories about slavery when we talk about descendants. But the period of 1865 to 1930 or 1940 and place creation is not the typical story. The typical story is about an urban Black neighborhood or center, or it's about an established Black town, but not as much about some of these very discrete geographies and places. So we've really been taking the word out and outsider as far as we can. And the applications, the grant applications show that there's a great demand for support for this type of work, and it is a type of work that exists. So it's been really exciting to put out a concept that I saw reflected in myself and in the world, and to see that there are several more people out there who, though they may not use these words to identify this way, are really outsider preservationists.
I love that. And as we welcome questions to trickle into the chat, while you spoke and while I reviewed your slides yesterday, I really thought about how your work is pushing redefining success in preservation. The success is not always a historic designation. Sometimes it is a dance performance, right? Success and deliverables in preservation can come in a myriad of shapes, and how we define preservationist. So there are professional preservationists, but there's familial, there's recreational, there's a lot of different types of people who are preservationists. And you're challenging the power status quo as to who is an expert through this process, who can call them a preservationist. And this made me think about the conversations the past 10 years about the quote unquote relevancy issue in preservation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering that, do we have a relevancy issue, or do we have a pedagogy issue for how we are taught to view who does or does not value preservation?
You know, it's really difficult. I'm thinking about what often happens where you have an individual from a community and they know what they want, but they still require your expertise. They know that they need a landscape architect, right? They realize that they need certain expertise, but they don't want to lose autonomy and control, right? And I think that we lose our relevancy when we don't understand the service capacity that we need to have. And then when we don't admit the vision that we have, we are visionaries. We are preservationists. We can see value where others don't see value. We can see importance. We can see whole realities and imaginaries in places. It's an incredible, I think, calling to be a preservationist and a preservation educator. I do think that the relevancy issue comes in when you can have someone shut down one agency and all of us feel as if preservation is going to disappear. 70%, 75% of what is preservation is regulatory. I think we have a relevance problem if we can't explain what else we are other than what people assume, which is people who study history or architects or regulators. And if we're not historians, regulators, architects, we know we are so much more. This is not to be negative about those three, blocks. And Section 106, yes. Okay. Big cheerleader, deeply believe in it, will fight for it. But I would say that our relevancy problem is in not expanding the scope of what we know it to be so that more people can see themselves in it. And that's where I see the challenge, and that's why I do the work the way I do.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know we have at least one member in our audience who has also worked on how do we interpret and commemorate places that have been lost. Based on the initial grant rounds, what type of commemoration do you see applicants being drawn towards, or your peers who are working in the field? What type of commemoration beyond historic markers and the more traditional preservation storytelling are you getting to explore through your work?
So what I find really interesting are sports tournaments, or baseball games, where people want to hold these tournaments as a way to draw in people to these spaces where there were once limited spaces where you could engage in these activities as African Americans. And they often were gathering spaces for people from a number of different settlements, or they were on the edge of communities, especially in places out like in California. And so it's been really fascinating to see that variety, several people wanting to make films and documentaries. So the easier it gets to access to technology, the more people want to use it, which is fantastic. But the actual type of events, homecoming celebrations, that is, times when individuals would normally return back to their settlements to commemorate the founders and to remember those that they lost in the previous year that are buried in the cemeteries. These especially became popular after, I guess, the second wave, it would have been, of the Great Migration. So the first wave began in 1918, and the second wave more in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And during that 1930s wave, you saw the founding of a lot of these annual celebrations in these historic Black places to facilitate that return. It was a way to make people come back home, and it was a way specifically to make them come back home to see after those interred in the cemeteries in what were becoming increasingly remote or endangered areas. So there was a great rationale behind this. And so some of the people that have submitted applications have done a wonderful job at trying to revive those homecomings, or trying to make homecomings that maybe combine an entire region, to reconfigure in a way what it means to come home and what home is, and to have more people share into the notion of home. And they do it in ways that don't privilege biological kinship. And there's all manner of cultural and social networks that are elevated through the work that they're proposing that I just love.
And when will we all get to see the grand unveil so that people who all instantly are following you through
Yes.
newsletters and Instagram, when will we get to find out the big news?
April.
Um, and since we have a quiet audience, but I know some of them, I'm going to ask questions for them. We have someone in the audience who's really interested in elevating surveying approaches and how do we become more efficient and exploratory in surveying. And with the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, you spent a lot of time and energy mapping and documenting and doing community led surveying through the way you collected data. So how are you continuing to push and explore what surveying means beyond a windshield survey?
Yes. So one of the things that we're looking at is how people formulate tours, right? So there's how do you survey and understand and curate a tour, and how do you do that ethically? And so one of the things we're doing is working with a particular Black tour company to hold some focus groups with individuals from settlements who would like their particular settlement to be on a tour. So what does it mean? What do you have to prepare? How do you set the right boundaries? How do you not feel invaded? What do people expect? And can you provide it? And what's required? So those are the kinds of survey questions that we're doing, not a survey, but more in the form of focus groups. Texas Freedom Colony still stands. It still exists. We still have volunteers. And we have, I mentioned Gloria Smith before, who has used her surveys to form the basis of developing her, in her case, in her community. Markers are important. It's extremely rural, and she uses it as a way to contest the local historical society in which she perceives them as being resistant to even acknowledging these places. So for her, it is a protest measure, and she conducts the surveys herself with individuals in each of these places to both add to the atlas and to help her in that way. And she's been really successful with grant applications and been in Texas Monthly, and it's been really, really exciting to see her just blast off.
I think bringing up markers is really interesting when we think about who is leading the interpretation frequently. There was a number of years ago, different bands of the Ute in Utah and Colorado worked together to fight against historic markers, which were falsely construing cultural practices. Right? Like, and we had these researchers, quote unquote, who thought they were doing the right thing to elevate stories when in fact they were misconstruing. So I know we have a really great storyteller in our midst who is always creating interesting graphic novels and comics. And I think that when we look at preservation, right, you should not just be working to preserve Black history if you are Black. All of us need to be working in tandem.
Yeah.
But how can we help push storytelling and how we do it in new directions if that is not your lived experience, that you may have biases that you don't realize exist? How do we push ourselves as storytellers to do it in that equitable and accessible and community first way?
I think the principle is reciprocity. That's what I try to keep at the heart of whatever I'm doing. It could be storytelling, it could be curating an archive, it could be anything. But what does someone get? And I don't mean in a capitalist transactional way where if I just do this, I've taken care of you, right? I've given you cash. The big thing now is, oh, I've compensated someone. Look at me. I've given them, money for gas. Great. But what is it all really for? I think that's constantly asking that question. Who is it really for? I think continually asking what else are people getting out of it? And there is a constituency. There always is, even if you can't see them immediately. So it's involving that constituency if you're from outside of that community. Nothing for us without us. And I think everyone is responsible, as you say, Sarah. I'm responsible for honoring and protecting Latino history, queer history, indigenous places of significance. Everyone's responsible for everyone. And I think maybe the problems we have are the more we don't think that way, the more we have a problem. And also respecting people's autonomy and sense of self and agency over their own stories and how they're told must be respected, or else you're not doing anybody any favors.
Yes, could not agree more. And what does it mean when the community says they no longer feel comfortable being their story being told? How do we create responsive and reflexive preservation that isn't just rooted in it's all done, I did my outcome, I never need to come back for an amendment, I never need to update my standards?
Yeah, it's I would say that the reason why I'm also engaging or doing the outsider preservation project the way I am, or the initiative the way I am, is because I know how much I don't know it all. And I know how much innovation is out there among the outsider preservationists. And so as you ask these kind of questions about how to do it best, I think I've learned a thing or two, and there have been some positive outcomes. But I also know that what I've seen in these applications is how I know it, is that there are people out there doing some just boundary breaking work that are going to give us more of those answers, but we can't find them unless we are able to develop a way to organize and communicate the stories of what they do and what they've learned. And that's the mission of the Outsider Preservation Initiative, is to make sure we're elevating and projecting that out into the world.
I think that as preservationists, we are trained that we are experts, but being an expert on a topic doesn't mean you know everything, like you said. So being willing to confront your knowledge gaps, being willing to ask questions. I think you are willing to try things without fear of failure, which is something we should all be modeling as we shape our programs and our processes. It's all iterative and we continue to hone it as we move forward. So to be mindful of everyone's times, do you have any, final drops of wisdom for us as we move forth with our day, as we navigate what preservation is shifting toward potentially? Do you have any food for thought as we just push preservation in positive directions?
I think again, we have a grand opportunity under some difficult circumstances to rethink the field. And so I'm encouraging everyone to not give up on today, but to know that Build Back Better is not it. And in 2029, we should be looking at a much different field. And it's going to require all of us to reconstitute it. So I think one of the things that we have to think about as educators is we have to be super intentional about creating that new generation that's going to build everything, that's going to build from the rubble. That's what I think is kind of exciting about now, is if you're thinking about standing in 2029 and you would think to yourself, what if I had 4 years before now to create a whole new super heritage protector force or heritage justice force? What would a heritage justice force do and be? Where would they be? How would they operate? And how can I create them? So that is the mindset that I've kind of begun to cling to over the past few days. And at the same time, I think, we need to be taking up money to care for federal workers that don't have work, and we need to take care of them right now. And we need to keep going to court. I believe in all that. But I think that we have a unique opportunity to vision hard and to create something new out of this time.
Could not agree more. Historic preservation, the way the act that was created in 1966, they could have never imagined what our technology, what our social, what our cultural looks like. So let's continue to imagine and dream big. And we'll hand it off. Thank you so much for this conversation. We'll hand it off to Lauren or Blair to give us the updates on what's next for this series. But thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks you guys a bunch for this. It was a really wonderful conversation, and I think it worked well, the conversation versus just having, but it's nice when you know somebody as well as you do it. You can tell how close you two ladies are. I am going to say that our next fireside chat is scheduled for Tuesday, April 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern, I believe is the time we have. And we'll feature yet another discussion with Sarah Marsom and a woman by the name of Selah Moto Casper, who's the executive director of Latinos in Heritage Conservation. And I'm hoping that you guys can join us for that. We'll be sending out the registration email similar to how we did for this one. And then we'll have one final fireside chat coming up in the future. And thank you guys again for your time. And I appreciate you being here. And I'm really excited that we'll be able to edit this to get have it out there so that people who weren't able to join us could see it. And I'll hope that you all will help us share the word. All right.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
everybody have a wonderful afternoon or evening if that's where you're headed to.
Thank you,
Thank
Nikki.
you.
And thank you again for technical fellows for keeping us up and running. Appreciate you both.
For sure.